and welcome to MapleWoodian.com podcast. We have on the phone Kim Barker. How are you doing, Kim?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good. Now, you, of course, are the author of, well, one book with two names. First, it was The Taliban Shuffle, when it came out in, I believe, 2011.
Right.
And now redubbed Whiskey Tango Foxtrot.
Right.
And as they say, now a major motion picture.
Yeah, it's got 100% more Tina Fey.
There you go, right? And but the original book is the reissue under the new name a different book at all from the original?
No, it's exact. They didn't even have me do a different afterword or a different forward. It's exactly the same.
Well, that's actually probably good because it's not really tainted by Hollywood. And
no, totally not.
For those who don't know, you were at the Chicago Tribune from what year? 2000.
Well, I worked there from 2001 to 2009.
But it was 2004. You were overseas. Tell us what happened there.
I first went overseas for them for 4 months in early 2002, sort of in the aftermath of 9/11. Then I spent, I guess they call it the active war part. I say that with tongue-in-cheek, of Iraq in 2003, March and April. I spent that time in Afghanistan. And then I moved over to the region in 2004, and I lived there, going back and forth basically between India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan until I left the region in 2009.
And we should, of course, mention you will be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood Village tonight. That's Thursday, March 24th at 7:30. Signing copies and reading from this great book that is also, as we said now, a film starring Tina Fey as you. But back when you first wrote the book, and it was named then The Taliban Shuffle, what was it about your experience there? I've gone through some of it. It seems like, as the movie does, but it seems like your writing has a mix of kind of the horrors and craziness of being in a war zone, but also maybe not the humor, but kind of the absurdity. That's a good word, right? Yeah. Tell us first what brought that about. When you first sort of noticed the strange situation you were in?
I mean, I think a lot of people who spend time in a conflict zone, the only way to really make sense of it is through this absurdist frame, especially if you're there for a long time and you see some of the same mistakes being made, or you just see the way everything unfolds. And there's a long history of this. I mean, long history of black comedies about war, whether you go back to Catch-22 or, there's MASH, pretty much anything by early Kurt Vonnegut, and I just sort of have always seen everything through, excuse me, I've always seen everything through this sort of darkly comic frame from growing up, and I don't know if it's because my dad had it, but he also had me reading these books when I was really, really young. And I think that sort of infused my sense of humor and my sensibility and the way I see the world. And again, it was like when I was over there and I started saying to friends, I'm thinking about writing this darkly comic, absurdist book about our time in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And everybody over there said, I totally know what you mean. They got it immediately. And I get a lot of emails from folks who are in the State Department or folks who are in the military saying your book is the only one that made sense of the Afghanistan that I saw over there, and then it's funny because I'll say to people, who've never been in such a situation, I'm writing a darkly comic book about, being in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is back when I was writing it, and some people here just said, there's nothing funny about it. How could you possibly do that? And it's just because they don't know. And I think that this sort of tradition of seeing, conflict through this lens kind of went away after the draft went away in America. Because during the draft, everybody knew somebody who was at war, or they were at war themselves. So I think that everybody could relate to having a major, such as in Catch-22, and that's less so now.
Right, and you do talk about. I looked at the one review that I think got a lot of attention. I think you mentioned to Vanity Fair that this review that the New York Times did in 2011 first mentioned the sort of Tina Fey-ish character that you became, and that, of course, leads to the movie that is now out. But it also did talk about MASH being kind of the black comedy kind of look at war, and you said Catch-22 and others. And how does that help, you think, people understand is it the idea that if you just keep throwing negative and horror stories, even though they're real, that people get a little overwhelmed? But if you kind of show, not only is this horror and this is war and this is terrible, but you're very critical of how the war is handled, the wars are handled, and how Pakistan and Afghanistan are handled, and how they're covered.
Right.
What sort of drew that approach?
I mean, when I came back, I was so frustrated with really everything. I was frustrated with the direction of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I was frustrated with the fact that, like, my newspaper was getting rid of foreign correspondents and what was happening with journalism. And I just wanted to come up with a way that would make people actually read. And, you know, I agree with you. I think the constant drumbeat, I mean, look, we started these wars after 2001. It's been a long time. It's been, 15 years. And almost 15 years, and you really do have the sense that there's a sense of war fatigue, that people are tired of hearing about it. They're tired of hearing about, death and destruction, and they were in 2009 as well. So I was just trying to come up with a way that was different, that was relatively entertaining, that mixed the horrible with black humor in a way that people might actually find a page turner and want to keep reading to see what happens next. Because, the book is very entertaining, but the whole goal in writing it in the way I did was that by the end of it, I wanted people to actually have a primer on Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mean, it's not sophisticated policy analysis by any means, but I think that if you read the book, you'll understand how we got to where we are now, because the end of the book still holds up when it comes to Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Now, you open it with, I love the opening title, Welcome to the Terror Dome, Chapter 1.
Right.
And you said, I always wanted to meet a warlord. You talk about meeting Pachachan Zadran. Am I close to pronouncing that correctly?
Pachachan Zadran.
And a very good, lengthy story about what that was like. And is this sort of also different from maybe what people's opinions, not only of what war correspondents have been, but even what goes on today or at the time you were there? That was very... what is it about that meeting and that person that you think was a good way to sort of dive into the story for people? I thought it was very descriptive.
I was trying to come up with a way to start the book that would sort of give away where I was at the beginning of this journey.
Right.
There are a lot of books by war correspondents where you have the benefit of hindsight in writing a memoir or writing a book in general, right? You don't have to reveal all your own flaws and all the mistakes that you made. And I think there's a tendency not to do so because, you've got the benefit of hindsight. Why make yourself look bad? I wanted to make myself look bad. I wanted to make myself look naive. I was very much the foil for America going into these places, and America knew nothing about Afghanistan or Pakistan for that matter. So I'm very much, you're sort of like water carrier in as American, and making mistakes. So I had to pick a story that started near the beginning that sort of showed how naive I was. And why I like that story is because I went in there and I just thought it was a lark, man. It's like I'm going to meet a warlord. Look at these guys. They're wearing eyeliner and they've got flowers in their hair. And, they got Bollywood stickers on their guns. This is hilarious. I mean, that was initially my first reaction. And I go in to meet this guy, and it's like I only found out later that the things I was saying were totally wrong. And I luckily had a wonderful translator fixer, Farouk, who, his character is played by Christopher Abbott in the movie, who just, would listen to what I said and just, totally not translate it, because, the warlord's asking him, is she scared of me? And so then I force Farouk to tell me, what is he saying? What is he saying? And, Farouk translates that for me accurately, and I say, no, totally. Why would I be scared of him? He seems like a really nice guy. He's giving us food, blah, blah. And Farouk just smiles at me and, turns to Pasha Khan and says, well, of course she's scared of you. You're a terrifying man. And it just sort of, I think, went to the whole idea that, I had no cultural understanding. And I was lucky enough to have somebody with me who could translate. The Americans and the military particularly didn't always have the right person to do the translation. They would have folks, who were Tajik going into Pashtun areas, Uzbeks going into Pashtun areas, things that just really didn't make any sense. So, I really wanted to have a story that showed that and then showed how wrong I was. Like when I had found out later on that, Pasha Khan had actually just held a couple guys. Pasha Khan had just held a couple guys who had been working for the American media, and threatened to kill them. And so when I found that out, of course, I was scared. And I think that like the story just sort of highlights how naive I was, and also just shows how important it was to have somebody with you who could actually navigate those waters.
And now, what's your quick background for people who don't know that got you? Are you from the Chicago area?
No, my mother's from Chicago. I'm from Montana and Wyoming. I grew up in Montana and Wyoming before moving to a suburb of Portland my senior year in high school. So I'm from out west, really rural, upper, lower middle class upbringing.
And when you started the Tribune, the story seems to paint the picture of someone wanting to kind of get away from the American usual scene of journalism and dive in. Is that true to force? What took you from?
I mean, 9/11, man. It's like
yeah.
it's like 9/11 happened, and if you're a journalist, I think a lot of journalists wanted to go see if they could do it. And I've always had a career sort of mentality that if I'm presented with 2 options or 3 options in a job, I'm going to try to pick the one that scares me the most and the one that I challenge the most. And so after 9/11, also as a journalist, I just want to see that. I just want to be able to cover the biggest story in the world and see if I can do it and be able to tell stories of folks who are, half a world away for people back home so they could seem somehow like their neighbors, I mean, that's always, I think, been a strength that I've had as a writer, is the idea of writing about people and telling people's stories. I mean, I continue to do that when I was over there. I would do those stories about how people lived through all this war, as opposed to just constant sort of drumbeat of doing, battlefront stories. I was not really drawn to the front lines per se.
Now you mentioned Farouk, and you talk a lot about him in the book, and I've gotten to interview some other war correspondents in the Middle East, and I know a lot of these translators or fixers are as important to you as anything else in your reporting.
Yeah, most important relationship you have.
What was it about him that you talk about him a lot in the book? What should people kind of know about that relationship, or what he did that helped or kept things going?
I mean, look, it's like when you're a journalist overseas and you don't speak the local language, you're dependent on somebody, in some cases several people, to basically keep you safe and to speak for you and to arrange interviews. And so the main relationship in the book, I would say, is between me and Farouk. It's not a romantic relationship. It's simply a friendship. He's very much the stand-in for Afghanistan as I am the stand-in for America, right? And so there are points where he doesn't come across so well, and he might take a little bit extra money from me because he thinks I'm leaving, much like Afghanistan and America. But for me, it's just here I had this guy, part of me feels bad for this. It's like we pretty much wiped out a good chunk of young doctors in Afghanistan by hiring them as fixers, right? Because they could work at the hospital and make $50 a month. With us, they could make $50 a day. And we went for the doctors because the doctors spoke English, and you needed somebody who could translate for you. And so, there's probably a good dozen of these guys who would work for various media outlets, even more at points when it was really crowded. And, Farouk was a great doctor. I constantly had sinus infections, so he constantly would sort of also function as my doctor. And he was just a natural-born journalist, really. I mean, he was so good at getting people to talk, and so, good at sort of, making anybody feel like they were a relative, or were somebody that they could trust. So.
And a lot of the book and a lot of the movie is obviously about a woman reporter in the Middle East. Not that it's obviously, I think women have overcome any criticisms for being able to be in a war zone and covering it or fighting it. But it does sound like you're still in a country or countries where women are still very much second-class citizens, and you talk about how you had to deal with that, again, on a humorous level, but also in your own relationship. You talked about boyfriend here, boyfriend back home. What was it about that people should know from the book that maybe they don't understand?
Well, the whole reason I did it, the whole reason I did the book and included that stuff is I always get very frustrated with memoirs of journalists where they don't put in their personal life in there. It's like you get half a memoir, So I wanted to be like a little just more. I'm very much the water carrier in this book, so I tried to write about myself like I would write about anybody who I was like having people through a story, another character, another person. So it means you include stuff in there that you might not necessarily want to include, but it's better for the story. It answers questions that the reader would have, right? What about your personal life? So, and I wanted to also show like the wear that being in a war zone and covering a war has on your personal relationships, because it just does. I mean, I think that that's going to be no surprise to anybody. And, you know, and it's part of like whether you're in the military, you know, and I write about like the whole idea of military, you know, constant deployments, what that does to relationships, and constantly being around this sort of, you know, violence and, you know, this adrenaline that you would feel covering these situations. It's just not necessarily good for a balanced life. And so I wanted to include that stuff in the book. And I do think that, like, as much as you say, like, women have been accepted as war correspondents, women have been accepted as this. I mean, like, one of the like, there were two critiques of the movie when it came out, and they were the same two critiques that the book got. You know, why is a woman writing about herself in these places? And related to that was, like, a description of the movie as being Eat, Pray, Love with guns, which is so insulting to me. I just can't even, like, it's so sexist. And I think and so that's one criticism. And I think both of those are sexist. I mean, there's plenty of men that are allowed to have male narratives of adventure, of just going overseas and pursuing an adventure. And it's not questioned, why is a man writing this story, right? Why is this book about a man? But that was one of the criticisms that really, really bothered me.
But is it criticisms from anyone who would be looked at as any kind of valid critic? Yeah, I think a lot of people. And maybe we're too close to it. I mean, you were there. I've covered journalism, and we maybe accept. But you're right. I can imagine that there's always going to be probably some of that.
There's always going to be some of that. Like, why is, like, and also, like, you know, the whole, like, this one sort of description. There was this one story that somebody was fact checking, and I'm like, you know, I knew what I was doing, right? Like, I start off naive, but I know how to be a reporter, and I knew how to tell a good story. It's not like Legally Blonde in Afghanistan. And he's like, okay, note to self, I will make sure this does not sound like Legally Blonde in Afghanistan.
And maybe the fact that Whiskey Tango Foxtrot and Eat, Pray, Love are similar kinds of titles, still that doesn't excuse it. That probably means someone's lazy in their attempts to be interesting.
But here's the narrative that goes to. The narrative that goes to, and it's the same narrative that Shutter Babe has, where you've got, in several other female memoirs, where you go overseas for adventure and you end up finding love, right? And that's what really matters. And, like, I didn't want to tell that story, you know, and I was in a really healthy relationship at the end of the book, and I don't include it in the book because I feel like that there should be room for more female narratives out there. And, like, the whole idea that, like, sometimes you decide to come back not because of somebody else, but because you decide inside that you've had enough on your own and that you want to try to have a more balanced life. And it has nothing to do with anybody else, you know?
Okay, we're talking to Kim Barker. She is author of Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Will be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood Village. Let's just ask you quickly about the movie. Now, again, I mentioned this New York Times review in 2011 by Michiko Kakutani. Yeah. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. Again, threw in the idea of Tina Fey. How does it go from that to making the movie? And how involved were you in the movie, if at all?
I mean, it was crazy. She wrote that review, and Tina read the book within 2 weeks of that review coming out, because her people said, hey, look at this. And she said, I have to read that. And so within 2 weeks of that review coming out, she had pushed Paramount to option the book for the movie.
Excellent.
And become a co-producer, and she pushed Lorne Michaels to get involved. Because she's, like, interested in telling different women's stories, you know, and this is obviously, like, a different women's story. And so she, and then it's like, you know, I had no idea if it would actually happen. There's plenty of books that friends have written that, you know, get optioned and nothing ever comes of it.
Oh, sure.
So it was, like a couple years, I think, and then I start hearing that, like, the screenwriting is actually going to happen. I started meeting with a screenwriter pretty regularly. I think that was either in 2014 or 2013, one of the two, maybe 2014. And he started meeting with a lot of friends of mine who had been to Afghanistan, and then, like, friends of his who had been to Afghanistan, lots of folks in the military. And it's like anybody who sees the movie, I mean, I just got a note from an Afghan translator yesterday who was like, I went into this movie being totally suspicious, because nobody ever portrays Afghanistan correctly. And he's like, but this did. And he was really shocked by it. There's a lot of sort of inside jokes and sort of like things in the movie that like only somebody who's been there are going to catch. And everybody else is just going to be sort of like nice local color. But like, I was really surprised at the amount of research that he did and that the, filmmakers did. And I did, but it's not like I had much to do with it. I mean, he wrote his own screenplay based on the book. I didn't even read the screenplay because they sent it to me, I think, in February. Oh, okay, so it would have been 2013 I was meeting with him. They sent me the script in like February 2014 and, told me I couldn't make any changes to it. I was like, well, if I can't make any changes to it, why sweat it? So I never even read it. So I met with Tina. I had lunch with her like in late 2014, and then I went out on set in early 2015 for a couple of days. But it's not like I had any input whatsoever. And like my first sort of like knowledge of what they did with the book was seeing the film in February.
And what did you think? Do you think it portrayed well, or was it difficult?
I mean, like, it's difficult to say. It was really difficult to watch it for the first time.
I'm sure.
As a journalist, you're going along and you're going, true, false, kind of true, made up, false. You know what I mean? And you're like sort of like interspersing the fiction with the nonfiction. And, I mean, obviously they had to change a lot. They turned my character into a TV reporter. They cut out Pakistan altogether. I know, poor print journalism. And, like, they cut out Pakistan altogether, and they have me having a romantic relationship that I didn't actually have. But all in all, I think they did a great job because the narrative arc of the character of Kim is pretty much my narrative arc. The most important relationship to me, the one between me and my translator, is still the most important relationship in the movie. And I think that they showed what it was like to have to cover war that long and what was happening to journalism in this whole fight to get stories about a country that nobody cares about any longer. And, this forgotten war that remains forgotten. So I was pleased with it, and I was pleased with how respectful I felt like they were of the source material. I think if people see the trailers, they're like, oh, that just looks like a laugh riot. But if you go to see the movie, it's actually a different movie. It's a dark comedy, and there's parts of grimness and sadness in it, just like there are in the book.
And there also seems to be sort of a parallel with someone like Tina Fey, who's you talk about sort of breaking through this image of women in the war zone, but she has kind of broke through in comedy in many ways. She is a very attractive woman who is also very funny and very smart. And I think I heard an interview with her talking about the movie, and I think some of the interview was saying she didn't really go along with some of the caricatures of a woman in comedy, and really had to work and be thought of as more than just sort of the dumb blonde, although she's not blonde. Sort of smart comedy and got into a leadership role, and she's got her own control. The fact that she could make this movie and get it made, do you see the fact that someone like that portrayed you as helpful or no?
Awesome. I mean, like, she's been nothing but awesome throughout this entire process. I mean, like, she had me do, like, a couple shows with her. I got to do, like, this late-night Bravo show with her where I actually had to be funny, which was rather challenging, because it's like, that's not my job, to be funny on demand, So it's like, if I have time to sit around and write a story, I can get to funny, but being impromptu funny is difficult. But she wanted to give me that chance, I think, to sort of like highlight the fact that it was my book and that, I had written it, and like every single late night performance she's done on it, she mentions me by name, and she mentions the title of the original book. And I don't know a lot of people in Hollywood who do that. It's almost like they say, yeah, it was based on a book, or they might not even mention that. They just talk about their new movie, and she just wanted to be, I felt like she was just being generous toward me every step of the way.
Now, what is your current, now you're at the New York Times currently?
Yes.
And what's your beat and life today?
Well, I mean, I'm in a courthouse today looking at records, and I, I'm on this special team that does investigative stuff on the Metro desk. So I can't really say what we're working on because then I'd have to kill you.
Okay, well, I'll add you to the list of people who want to kill me for knowing what they know. But you're in the New York area and living here,
Yeah, I live in Brooklyn. Yeah.
And is there another book in the works, or maybe in a different world, or is that it?
I want to have. I have like 2 book ideas. It's all about trying to figure out how I can juggle, having this great job and that I'm really passionate about with being able to do books. So I'm trying to figure out how to get another week's worth of hours during the week, and it's just sort of like, I guess, if there's a sugar daddy who's listening to this, I need money. No, I'm kidding. I don't actually.
Lots of investors in our little town, I'm sure.
Right. No, I'm so blessed to be able to have this great job, and so it's like I had a couple book ideas, but everything's on hold right now because I'm really excited about the stories that we're working on.
Excellent.
And when I have spare time in the evenings and the weekends, I tend to work on the stories as opposed to personal projects.
Well, I appreciate you taking time with us. Again, we've been talking to Kim Barker. She is the author of Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, also known as The Taliban Shuffles, be at Maplewood Village's Words bookstore at 7:30 p.m. And come by, get the book, get it signed, hear her great tales. And there's lots in there to like and to learn about. And I thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Be well.